1940 was an election year in America, and FDR was promising to keep America out of the European war. And the Vice President of the U.S. had been awarded a raise from $5,000 to $12,000 per year in 1938, and Britain had immediately signed a treaty with Germany allowing Hitler to have Czechoslovakia in exchange for reparation payments due the Crown from the Great War, now possible with Germany's expanded economic base in Czechoslovakia. Air raid drills began in England in response to Germany taking over Czechoslovakia, half of whom spoke German anyway, and the Slovak half of Czechoslovakia was Russian. The pact between Hitler and Stalin split Poland between Russia and Germany, and at first the Germans held up their part of the bargain by occupying their half of Poland on the 1st of September in 1939, and the Russians moved into their half on the 17th of September, and the Germans and the Russians lined up anyone who could speak English and shot them dead just to be sure, while the British Expeditionary Force was sailing over to the French-Belgian border just 30 miles away from Calais. There would be no shooting during the phony war while British and German agents entered into some furious currency speculation in Brussels, and to put an end to the ruin of their currency, the German army marched into Brussels to close down the banks until some sense could be brought back to the market. After yellow journalism in England spread paranoia about Jew communists infiltrating and crippling the French and German banks in 1924, resulting in the Labour Party being soundly defeated, the Crown went back to the gold standard in 1925, hoping to increase the worth of the pound, but this made British exports more expensive, so corners were cut at the workplace, and as wages were lowered, the workers went out on strike again, not just over pay cuts, but because the workplace conditions had worsened. 2.5 million English went out on strike in 1926, but were silenced by the Crown and forced to go back to work under threat of death. Most countries went back on the gold standard from 1923 to 1929, but some did not, and England had gone back to gold in 1925 with the Dawes Plan, hoping to squeeze some gold out of Germany. But the English continued to strike and riot, so the Crown made union activity illegal in 1927, and now brother unions could not strike in support of others on strike, and political funds and union dues were strictly controlled. The following year, movie pictures with sound came over to England, and in 1928 the Crown took over control of the BBC. The newspapers spread fake news that Germany was defaulting on war reparations, and the U.S. Treasury had loaned a great deal of money to Germany to help them pay France and England for reparations from the Great War, and the fake news said that the American banks were failing along with the U.S. Treasury, and many Americans grew concerned that their money was no longer safe in banks, and the Panic of 1929 got underway. People began to cash in their bonds and put their money under their mattresses, and once the panic started, it couldn't be slowed because it was physically impossible to move cash fast enough to satisfy the demand. Depositors would line up for blocks demanding their cash, and if the bank closed its doors and told their customers to come back in a few days, more and more people in the next few days would show up demanding their money. As banks failed from depositors withdrawing their money, the stock market was doomed, and there was no central bank in America such as was operating like the Bank of England, so each American bank was left on its own to live or die. The small banks had been sending depositors money to larger city banks in 1928, and the city banks were loaning that money to people buying stocks, and all the banks made a small profit from the interest on these loans. People who had bought stocks on margin needed to add cash to their portfolios when the price of stocks fell below the amount of their loans no longer covered by the price of their collateral, and desperate for cash, stock owners would sell at lower and lower prices until a buyer could be found, and as stock prices fell, the borrowers could not make payments on their loans and were forced to sell more of their stocks, while the lower priced stocks no longer were acceptable as collateral on further loans to buy back stock. The stock price tumbled downwards as nobody could come up with the money to buy them, and more stocks needed to sell to meet payments on the original loans. And the banks tried to sell seized property that had been used as collateral, money that was needed to pay the bank's employees, but there were fewer and fewer buyers stepping forward. Because a run on gold would not end well, America decided to declare a moratorium on European war debts that wouldn't happen until 1931. But all the insiders knew about it beforehand and got out before the stock market crashed. At the end of 1929, the Young Plan replaced the Dawes Plan, allowing Germany to make payments after the stock market had crashed, because Germany was suffering over all the American dollars they had invested that had now disappeared. Half of Germany wanted people to rule themselves, as Russia was doing, and the other half wanted to return to the stable nobility who could negotiate with Britain over reparation payments. The Germans had soon enough become terrified of their fellow Germans, and there weren't enough police to keep order, and the German army was split right down the middle. America offered to help Germany with loans, but when some Germans stepped forward to accept American aid, Britain responded by cutting off the importation of food. When America forced the Young Plan on Britain in 1929, the British started calling loans on other countries that in turn began abandoning gold until September of 1931, and after 1931, Britain also abandoned gold again, and another collapse on Wall Street caused the Young Plan to be scrapped in 1932, and while $2 trillion were made available from the RFC to make loans, FDR's New Deal was offering direct assistance from the government instead of pushing loans, and that would make the market crash again in 1934. The Lausanne Conference in 1932 had canceled German reparations altogether, and the following year Hitler was appointed Chancellor, and England, Italy, and some other countries made a meager attempt in June of 1933 to pay a portion of the war debt due to the U.S., but France paid nothing, and Finland paid in full. To help England and India, Spain and China, the Thomas Amendment relented on the silver standard asked by London, and the U.S. declared an emergency on the 13th of December in 1933 because a decent society wouldn't work unless and until most of the people believed it to be fair. All belligerents and neutrals had gone off the gold standard in 1914 for the Great War, but the U.S. was one of the few who had kept their paper money pegged to gold, and the U.S. made exporting gold from America illegal from late 1917 to the summer of 1919, and redeeming currency with gold was not encouraged, so it was more of a semi-gold standard. It all went swimmingly until people learned that the U.S. Treasury was loaning great amounts of money to Germany to pay their war debt to Britain from the Treaty of Versailles. And because the British were insisting on payment in gold rather than in paper cash, people were rushing to buy gold, paying higher and higher prices until gold was selling for much more than it was worth. When a bank refused to exchange paper for gold, that paper money had lost its value, and countries went off the gold standard because they were running out of gold. And banks went off the gold standard because people had gone off the farm standard. While France was still on the gold standard, a franc was worth 4 cents to the gold dollar, and within 6 months, of FDR stopping the gold exchange, a franc was worth 6 cents, and 3 months after stopping gold payments, FDR told the London World Economic Conference that the U.S. was not returning to gold, but wanted to make prices in America rise with the depreciation of the dollar. The Greenback Dollar had been printed after the war between the states to pay for the war debt, and the greenback could not be used for import tariffs that required gold, and interest on the U.S. public debt had to be paid in gold, and that would make Congress borrow responsibly. The greenback was fiat money from 1861 to 1879, when greenbacks were allowed to be exchanged for gold, and that would continue until the U.S. went off the gold standard in 1933, when Britain refused to allow Germany to use greenbacks on loan from America to pay England to pay America. A Confederate dollar had been worth 90 cents in gold, but by the end of the war between the states, a Confederate dollar was worth 0.017 cents. 0.017 cents. Because the North had doubled its money supply while the South had increased theirs by 20 times. The U.S. would retire greenbacks at various times, but after 1879, they were recirculated back into the American economy, fixing their value at $346,681,016. The U.S. Treasury was required to keep a certain minimum amount of gold in their vaults, and when people began exchanging their paper money for gold at any price, that made gold more and more expensive to buy, and so going off the gold standard would not only stabilize the currency, but would also stop people from trying to hoard gold. When FDR abandoned the gold standard in 1933, he signed the Debt Default Act, so foreign governments who had defaulted could no longer get any more loans from the U.S. Treasury, and that was intended to make Europe too poor to be able to carry on any war without supplies and loans from America. With this plan by FDR, it was assumed that Europe would now have a lasting peace. In going off the gold standard, everyone in the U.S. was required to surrender their gold certificates and gold coins in exchange for cash, and all American gold coins were melted down into bars, and the new dollar was worth 60% of its former value. The dollar lost no value for a month after the announcement because people thought it was just a temporary halt to stabilize the gold market, but the gold ban stayed, and soon it took more dollars to buy a British pound, and that meant that instead of buying tin boxes from England, it was cheaper to buy tin boxes made in America. As English tin box makers became unemployed, they joined the rest of their countrymen rioting in the streets. Since going off the gold standard in the spring, an ounce of gold was selling for a little over $20, but by the middle of the first month of the new year, the price was now over $34. The U.S. had only spent $130 million buying back gold, but speculators had pushed the amount of dollars traded to over $1 billion, and commodity prices had so far failed to rise despite the increased money supply. Since America only went off the gold standard domestically to raise prices and make more dollars available to Americans, it still kept to the gold standard internationally, so the British had to either buy dollars with gold and lose their own supply, which would force them off the gold standard, or fork over more gold than they thought was fair. America loaned Germany dollars to buy gold, to pay to England, to pay to America, and the loan was much larger than Germany had imagined, because by then it cost a pretty penny to buy a piece of gold. But Britain was still not satisfied with Germany's renewed gold payments. America went ahead and loaned gold to Germany, and the British claimed that the gold was worth less than the U.S. said it was, so when Britain demanded more gold from Germany, they asked the U.S. Treasury to loan more, and the price of gold began to fall as America hauled it out of the vaults and shipped it to Germany. When Germany received a pile of gold, they would print the going amount of German cash and send it to Britain, who insisted on gold, not cash. Britain owed America plenty of gold, but with the lower price for gold, that gold being sent to the U.S. Treasury was worth less, and so the British balked at having to pay more. The U.S. announced it would buy newly mined gold at 30% more than the going rate and 27 cents more than it was selling overseas, and people rushed to trade their gold for U.S. dollars. When the U.S. started buying gold in Europe, the price went up higher, and $1 billion of depreciated U.S. dollars went in the pockets of gold sellers by January of 1934, and by that time, the U.S. Treasury had gathered 2/3 of the world's gold supply. Speculators had moved $1 billion in gold sales, and on the 30th of January in 1934, the U.S. declared the domestic dollar to be off the gold standard, but international trade and all debt between America and other countries was to be done only in gold bullion regulated by the U.S. Treasury. Sweden had wanted to give Mr. Dawes the Nobel Peace Prize for coming up with the Dawes Plan, which was that Germany would pay England reduced reparations in gold, but pay the Americans back in America's own inflated dollars. But the Americans had just said no and passed the Young Plan instead, which put Germany and England back on the same level playing field. The sale or purchase of gold within America as money was outlawed except with a license from the Treasury, and while the dollar was now off the gold standard in America, prices in America did not rise as had been hoped. FDR had announced the embargo on gold on the 19th of April in 1933, and that had made those wondering whether the March 6th law was just temporary stop their wondering, and on the 12th of May, the Thomas Amendment let Britain make payments in silver, but they only made a token payment instead of offering something meaningful, while France refused to participate in any scheme they knew favored Britain. The U.S. was kind enough to hold the July 1933 World Monetary and Economic Conference on British soil to make it as easy as possible for Britain to agree to pay their fair share, and agreeing to trade in silver was called the Limping Standard, and quickly proved that any bimetallic system would quickly become a single standard of either gold or silver, just as the French had warned. The following month in August, FDR nationalized silver and told Britain they were in default, which meant war, because if the Crown was allowed to repay America in silver, they could print cheaper money, then send silver to America and bring down the price of English coal, so Italy would rather buy it from England than Germany, then raise the wages of the working class by paying them in the inflated funny money, and that would make the American dollar too expensive for foreigners to use. So by being allowed to pay in silver for that brief window of time in the summer of 1933, when FDR tried to give the Crown a chance to redeem itself, the Crown had squandered the opportunity by paying only a meager portion of their obligation. Belgian banks still exchanged their money for gold until 1935, and France until 1936, and banks charged a small fee for exchanging money between the warring countries and enjoyed the fluctuating exchange rates when money moved back and forth. Britain had set up a currency stabilization fund in 1932 by putting £175 billion into an account for use in stopping speculators, and shortly had to add £200 billion more. When more dollars were needed to buy pounds, the British bankers would buy up pounds, and when pounds began selling for less than dollars, the stabilization bankers would buy dollars, and so the stabilization fund lost a little money, but kept the currency from being destroyed by foreign currency speculators. In 1934, the U.S. Treasury set up a stabilization fund of its own with the $2 million of the $2,822,374,757 profit from the reevaluation of gold. And because Belgium stayed on the gold standard until 1935, the panicked Germans could take a suitcase full of Belgium cash to Germany, trade it to Germans desperate for a gold-backed currency, then take the tenfold German money back to Belgium and exchange it for more Belgium cash to take to Germany. The counter-black market experts, once they were trained, soon found they could come to profitable terms with the marché noir. They worked in with the French. The most scandalous rackets were organized. For example, 50,000 sweaters were sold in a single day, not once, but 4 times over. The first 3 buyers were simply assassinated. The 4th was himself in with the group of swindlers. Consequently, the sweaters could again be offered for sale later on. Meanwhile, the amount realized from the first 3 sales were already in the bag, viz. 3 times the price of 50,000 pullovers. People disappeared. Locomotives disappeared. Hundreds of thousands of kilos of the best cigarette paper disappeared. Wilder and wilder grew the activities due to the corruption of the security police in the counter-black market office. Agents continually arrested or assassinated one another. Gestapo officials masqueraded as French gangsters, and the latter as Gestapo officials. The Monte Cristo cover-up by Johannes Mario Simmel, translated from the German by James Clue. Original title, It Can't Always Be Caviar. New York Doubleday and Company, Inc., 1965. Popular Library, 1977. Page 323. The British were demanding only gold from Germany so they could pay America, and FDR melted down the 445,500 double-eagle $20 gold coins made in 1933, and it became illegal for the Treasury or any American bank to exchange gold for cash, which meant that foreign speculators couldn't buy dollars with gold, take them to Germany to trade for wheelbarrows full of cash, exchange that German cash for gold in Switzerland, bring the gold to America, and make a 50% profit buying up more dollars. On September 12, 1939, a young American diplomat traveled by the regular 8:35 a.m. express from Paris to Brussels. He was dressed like an English banker and carried a big black pigskin suitcase. Officials on the Franco-Belgian border were very strict. The immaculate young gentleman's diplomatic passport, which opened out like an accordion, enabled the representatives of both nations to identify him as William S. Murphy, official courier to the American embassy in Paris. His baggage was not investigated. In Brussels, the American courier, who was really a German named Thomas Leven, checked in at the Hotel Royal, producing a Belgian passport in the name of Armand Deacon. During the following day, Deacon, alias Murphy, alias Leven, spent 3 million French francs in Brussels buying up dollars. The francs came out of the black pigskin bag and the dollars went into it. Thomas's original stock of the 3 million francs had been supplied by his own little bank. Political events had caused the international value of the French francs to fall by 20%. Private citizens in France, in their panic fear of a further devaluation of the franc, were intent on buying up dollars. Consequently, dollar quotations had risen in a few hours to astronomical heights. This was not the case in Brussels. Their dollars could be acquired at a substantially lower price, since the Belgians had not been infected by the French terror of war. They expressed their firm convictions by the statement, "We shall remain neutral. Under no circumstances whatever will the Germans attack us for the second time." In consequence of the swift decision taken by the French government to forbid the export of capital to foreign countries were being flooded with French francs. The franc, therefore, in spite of the unfavorable circumstances, was remaining fairly stable, just as Thomas had anticipated. Its relative stability constituted, so to speak, the axis of the whole operation. Thomas Leven, as William S. Murphy, traveled back to Paris with a suitcase full of dollars. Within a few hours this valuable currency was eagerly snapped up by the same rich people who intended to leave their country in the lurch as soon as possible and carry off their capital into safety. Thomas Leven made them pay double and triple prices for the realization of their despicable plans. His first journey brought him in 600,000 francs personal profit. Next, again as William S. Murphy, he returned to Brussels with 5 million francs in his courier's luggage. He repeated his procedure. The margin of profit rose. 1 week later, 4 gentlemen with diplomatic passports were traveling back and forth between Paris and Brussels, as well as between Paris and Zurich. They were taking francs out of the country and dollars into it. 2 weeks later, there were 8 of them. Thomas Leven was in charge of the entire transaction. Monte Cristo cover-up, page 61 and 2. When bankers banded together for a capital strike at the beginning of 1938 to protest the New Deal economics, they told Hitler to stop spending for war, and Hitler had taken this for a Jewish plot. Hitler believed that Germany was bringing truth out into the open by naming the Jews as the Antichrist, and he said that Germany would be victorious because America and England were still not confronting the reality of the Jews. Germany had heard the message coming from the BBC and matched Britain's rearmament efforts, while Britain's rearming did not improve things for the English working class. And in support of working people, Hitler was welcomed into Austria by the common folk. The Nazis said there was no room in the Reich for people more rich or more poor than themselves, and that they who do not work should not eat. And Nazis wanted everyone to be middle class and hard-working, but they were split between either the socialists tending towards communism or the nationalists comprised of the leftover nobles and their supporters. So Hitler chose the name of National Socialism to bring both sides under his common flag.